so great. And we are all here because of Ann Ayers, and I saw Ashley is on the Zoom because Ann, in early September, emailed Nikki and Jim and myself and said I was reading the paper this morning and read all about the Charlotte Remembrance Project, and she had been on one of the Covenant Civil Rights tours back in 2019, and they had been to the National Memorial and learned about this work. And so when she read it that day, she was like, you have got to get Helen Schwab to come and aware us about this, and use the Jamar Tisby term. And so, and then it happened that these 2 weeks, Matt and we're like, oh, we want to, but the programming is awful. And then just kind of magically these 2 weeks opened up, and I reached out to Helen and she said yes for both nights. And so we're so grateful. And then she invited Justin Perry to come along, and thank you so much for being here. And I think you both know so many people that both have deep connections at Covenant, so thank you both so much for that. And I am not going to yammer on about introducing you more, because I want you to get to do that about your work. But before y'all start, Nikki was going to open us in prayer, and I'm going to move out of where the Zoom can see me. I'm going to come sit right here.
Holy gracious God, you have been in this room far before it was a room, before it was just land. Before there was land, you were God. And so just as matter evolves, so too do our internal worlds. And so in this short hour, move us along in our journey. Chip away the behaviors of whiteness within us, and pull us onward toward the journey of restoration, of racial reckoning, and of healing. As our bodies may or may not put up defenses within us, may grace's concentric circles slowly dissolve those of blame and shame. And so be with us. Stir us and transform us. Amen.
Hey, is it okay if I bring my class in here?
Yeah, we love that.
All right, they're all done. Okay, why don't we go over this way?
They would love us to all be in a circle.
Do you mind switching over?
How are you doing? Good to see you.
We got one here, two here actually.
So I'm going to say out loud right now before everybody's settled. So I need to turn on my screen to share with the Zoom, and then I need to turn it off, and then I need to turn it on again. So help me if you see that I'm not doing that, okay? Because Jason said a lot of things really fast, and I may or may not have actually understood. Thank you all for being here so much. The Remembrance Project, here's how we're thinking this can go. Let's see if this sounds okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the project is. Justin is going to orient us for conversation, some ground rules, talk through that. I'm going to show a very short video, 1:26 seconds. Tell you a little more context, then show you a short film that was commissioned for this project that we used to kick off conversations. Then, depending on how our time is going, I will tell you a little bit more about one of the men we're talking about. We're talking about two men who were killed in what EJI refers to as racial terror lynchings because of the recognition that these were done to terrorize a community, very specific purpose. And also as a preliminary lynching, the word lynching means only killing someone without due process. It does not mean hanging. There were many forms of fatal violence used. So that's been confusing even to us as we started. There were people who said, oh, I didn't realize that. So just to kind of set those. The project began in one of those bus trips down to the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is such a word salad, I have to stop and think. If you have not been to Montgomery, which I still have not been, I, based on everyone's recommendation, highly recommend. Imagine lots of you have been. The Remembrance Project grew out of EJI's effort to memorialize and reckon and understand and talk about and tell this history. And Brian Stevenson, who runs EJI, will say it much more eloquently than I. Share screen. Now, let's see if I can actually do that.
Yeah.
Pause. Wrong one. Apologies. It has skipped in Jason's very good work. You skipped it.
Can you hit back on that YouTube screen?
I can get there quickest if I do this, which is the actual site. I can go here, but I'm gonna go to YouTube's.
In Berlin today, you can't go 100 meters without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family that was abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial because they want to express their awareness that something horrific happened and that it can never happen again. The Germans want to stand with Jews and say, never again. We have a 9/11 memorial in the United States. It took us less than 15 years to build that memorial. I think it's important. I think it's necessary that we memorialize and concretize what happened on that dreadful day. But it speaks to me about what we haven't done for the thousands of lynchings that defined a generation of people. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We have to own up to the fact that there are places in this country where humans were trafficked, where there were slave auctions. We have to acknowledge the places. We have to recognize the places where terror lynchings took place. There aren't places you can go in this country and be confronted with the history of racial terror and violence and walk out and say, never again. And because nobody says never again, what we see happening is, well, it happening again. And so we have to do that truth-telling work. And then when we tell the truth, only when we've told the truth, can we begin the hard part of repair.
He says that eloquently. In the other one that I meant to show you, he says more specifically, if you go to Germany, you don't walk a block without seeing a marker to a family that was abducted in the Holocaust. And the reason that the Germans want you to see that is that they want you to know it. They want you to know this history. And by marking it, we can say collectively, never again. It took us 15 years, less than 15 years, to erect a 9/11 memorial to those people who died. And as Brian Stevenson says, I'm glad we did this. It's important to do that. It was a good thing to do that. But it speaks to him of what we haven't done, which is we have never talked about lynching that formed a generation of people in this country. And the idea of the Remembrance Project is to tell these stories, man by man, person by person, woman by woman, child by child, who were lynched to terrorize a community. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. That you look around us.
Sure.
You know, the one thing I always think, the one piece that's missing to add to that is I think not only did we not actually lift up the victims of lynching, but we've actually celebrated those who carried it out, right? Like, because again, I've been to the 9/11 memorial, and the only names you see on there are the people who died. You don't see ISIS flags. You don't see Osama bin Laden statues. No one goes to bin Laden Elementary School, right? But the way we do the history of this is to actually acknowledge the victims is to be divisive. But to actually lift up those who carried it out is just something we accept. So I think when we talk about this, especially given the fact that we're only a few weeks away from 9/11, right? Again, I always say we use two words with that, never forget, right? What we don't use is get over it. You know, we've had 3 or 4 classes of high school kids graduate, weren't even alive when it happened, but every year they were taught to never forget this and to look at it with a sense of gravity. And so I think the words terrorism are very important because I think a lot of us, when we hear terrorism, we think of 9/11. But I always say terrorism is what we were built on way before that for some of us. So as we move into conversation, there's several ground rules that we always like to try to do to kind of create the right kind of atmosphere, right? Because again, is this easy to talk about? Clearly not, because we haven't, right? But is it necessary to talk about? Clearly, because we have a forum. So we have, I'm going to use the ones that are here. I kind of have some of my own things in my head as well, but this is something that is on the website. So if you ever want to host your own kind of conversation, because part of our goal is to empower folks to be able to carry this out beyond here. We don't want this to be a one-off, but we want to help empower people to make a difference in your sphere of influence, right? So the first thing we want to do is when we have discussions, we want to assume the best intentions. We want to assume that again, when we speak, we are speaking from a place of authenticity and integrity, right? The next thing I want to invite all of us to do is to be present. There's going to be times where maybe there's a part of you that wants to kind of turn off, tap out. No. I'm going to challenge you to push through that and try to stay exactly where you are right now. In my world, we talk about keeping your head where your feet are, right? So I want to invite all of us to be right here in this moment tonight, in the viewing, in the conversation, and in the presence of each other and in the presence of God. I also want to invite us to listen to understand. You know, a lot of times we listen almost kind of like we're playing tennis and being prepared to counter shot. I'm one of those people who have done that in my life, right? I've learned to do it less, which has helped me in my marriage, right? but I think when we talk tonight, what I want to challenge all of us is to really try to listen to the perspectives that folks are offering and really digest it before we present our response. We want to invite folks to share their airtime. So again, we want to hear from as many people in here as possible. Some people are more confident speaking out loud. Some people are less confident. You know, what we want to challenge is that balance of some folks hitting the gas, but then also hit the brakes sometimes, right? Make sure we can kind of get as many voices and perspectives in the room as possible. And then the last thing we're going to ask you to do is to kind of lean into discomfort. Again, don't run from it. You know, there's going to be things that bubble up inside you. Don't run from them. Maybe question what's driving that, but lean into it. And hopefully if we get enough trust in the group, we get to the point where we can lean into each other as well to work through it. So with that said, we're going to actually kind of move into the direct material, and then at the end, we'll have some conversation, ask you all some questions and go from there.
So 2 men that were, to preface, EJI has a specific documentation process. So in this project, in this research, they have found from 1865 to 1950, near about 6,500 people who were killed in racial terror lynchings across the country, Oregon. I mean, it's not all in Mississippi.
How many?
And 6,500.
Okay.
And those are documented. So we know many, many, many more people died in lynchings than that, but these have been rigorously documented. And they have rules about what counts and what does not. In Mecklenburg, 2 men died, both 22 years old, one named Joe McNeely, one named Willie McDaniel. We commissioned a spoken word poet who has been at Covenant before, Hannah Hassan, to write about this. And what she did was interview us about, Gary, my husband here, is in the back behind Jane. And I did a lot of research onto each of the men's stories, and we spent a lot of time on sourcing 50 newspaper stories, hundreds of genealogical documents, wills, deeds, court rulings, police records. There aren't any from this time period. Court rulings, there are some, to try to put together a narrative. And Hannah created these pieces, and then we worked with young Black filmmakers who created this 7.5-minute film that we're going to share.
It is an institution as old as racism is long. Rooted in hatred, used to inflict pain and fear. Tortured thousands and thousands all over this nation. As American as slavery, racial terror, lynchings, it happened here. Beneath the buildings and towers, the skyscrapers and glass ceilings that tease that beautiful grand skyline, beneath the sports arenas and football fields, the parks and parkways that fulfill their promise of light moments of joy and ease and of good times, there is dark in this land. There's blood at the roots. There is injustice fertilizing the soil, bearing life, growing fruit, one life cycle at a time, from one generation to the next. This injustice will grab hold of your future. It won't let you forget.
I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud.
Before he was a murder victim, he was somebody's son. Before he would make the history books, first lynching documented in Charlotte, he was a brother. Before he lay, body on the ground, a human target, he was a human person sharing life with other humans together. A mob gathered, at least 35 white men, armed with enough ammunition to make McNeely pay. A scene so vicious, the nurse warned them when she saw them coming, "Y'all not gonna do this here today." But those warnings fell flat. They broke down the door and thus commenced the hunting. No one would ever be charged for Charlotte's first lynching on record, but if you seek deeply enough, the blood of Joe McNeely is what you will find. The current location, the soil is watered, where his cruel fate was ordered. Somebody's son, somebody's brother. Lynched by an angry mob, motivated by a superiority complex fueled in fear. A reminder of the cruel history that guards these grounds. There is no debating or denying that it happened here. Before he was found, murdered on the land that he called his home, he was someone's neighbor, someone's husband, partner in life. He probably loved on and hugged on, cherished his wife, planned a future, a family. That sad Sunday morning, a little black girl would find Willie McDaniel face down on the ground, broken neck and bruised wrist, 22 years old, murdered, deceased. The coroner's report says he died of a broken neck. The news headlines 2 days later read, "Dead Negro's friends claim he was lynched." By July 4th, news articles said they found a hanging tree. Not a soul called to justice, not a murderer named. Another instance of a tree holding hostage lifeless strange fruit. Another family left to find ways to heal through the pain. Though no one was ever charged with his murder, and some of the details remain unclear, there is no denying a man was lynched on these grounds that we walk on, laying lifeless moments from his home. It happened here. We must remember the tragedies. Remember that it happened to those occupying this space. The people, the injustice, the cruelty is a sad, cold reality that cannot and will not ever be replaced. There is a haunting over this land. And those who question why we need to conjure up these spirits, why we need to unearth this pain, often benefit from silence. Some continue to perpetuate the violence. So we stand in the truth of what has transpired. Listen with broken hearts to the stories that have stained this land. Hate the history with every ounce of our existence, while seeking to repair and maybe understand the generational impact of this brand of trauma and everything that it will take to heal a pain that has been compounded for over 100 years. We honor that a step forward in the process is allowing ourselves space to process the truth of racial terror lynchings, is that it happened here.
What do you think? Should we talk a little bit about Willie McDaniel, or do you think we should just?
We can give folks a chance to offer some initial thoughts and then go on that. I didn't want a full question, so what are your thoughts?
Listen, I'll just say, I did go down to Montgomery right before COVID hit, and I saw the memorial, but this makes it so real, right? I mean, we saw the, I don't know what he calls them, but the columns.
Monuments.
And we saw the ones laying there for Charlotte, and so there's a knowledge base, but this is really brings it. I appreciate this.
Others?
Just realize how desensitized we all have been to it. You know, as you said, 9/11, don't forget, this, get over it. It really sits heavy with me.
Definitely.
I went on the same trip with Ariel, and if I remember correctly, in addition to the engraved slabs, I call them, there was a duplicate slab that the idea was to move that duplicate to the location of the lynching. Is that part of what this project is?
Kind of, and I can answer that. There's 3 essential pieces to the project. The overarching piece is we hope people will talk about this. We hope that everyone who finds out this history tells this story and talks about it. That's the big hope. The physical markings of this are soil collections. So you saw the group gathering soil. We got into Panther Stadium. The Tepper Sports and Entertainment, which is the formal name we know now, gave us permission to go in and gather soil at that place. We know where that is. We can triangulate it because it was just outside. He was dragged out of Good Samaritan Hospital. So we know that that is in the not in the actual field, but under part of the stands where the stands are now. A historical marker at the site of each, or is in as close as we can figure out to where it was. The Panthers have also are working with us to place a marker on stadium grounds. They have committed to doing that. Reedy Creek Park, the county park, have committed to erecting a historical marker at Reedy Creek Nature Center, Nature Preserve. The third piece is to bring those enormous steel monuments that hang, I believe they call them monuments. When the prior work has been completed, the idea is that each county that has done this work will bring home its duplicate and erect it somewhere. Not necessarily because we have to, it will go somewhere. That is to be determined. But yes, that is part.
Does everybody know what Good Samaritan Hospital was? I realize you just kind of.
We couldn't read it was on the screen. That was the story of what happened.
Got it. Yes. So one Good Samaritan Hospital was the Black hospital in Charlotte at that time. And what they were saying was a group of men went and dragged him out of the hospital, stripped him down, and then killed him in the street. And so when they talk about the nurse trying to stop it, there was a Black female nurse who attempted to stop it, but obviously it was overrun.
We'll talk more about that story
Yes.
next week. So we hope you'll come back. We hope you'll bring a friend next week. We hope you'll share this yourselves as well. There's a whole toolkit on the website. I'm going to put a QR code up at the end to go to the website, just to say if you're writing ithappenedhereclt.com is the website, but I'll put a QR code up. Just to tell you a little bit more about the McDaniel story. This is a man, as Hannah told us, what we know is he was 22. He was a tenant farmer. He rented land from a man named Mel Greer. We know where that land is. We put the deeds and the wills and Polaris and a nightmare of detail together to figure out where that land is. There's a map on the website that shows you exactly where the land he owned was in June of 1929. Willie McDaniel was killed 3 weeks after what Charlotte papers at the time said was the biggest crowd ever in Charlotte history assembled. Throngs of shoving and shouting people to watch the Confederate Veterans Reunion Parade down Tryon Street. The crowds were estimated at 75,000 to 150,000 people. And the Observer covered it with the jokey headline, City Surrenders to Confederate Army. And the coverage, as a 30-plus year veteran of the Observer, as is Gary, was horrific on a scale I cannot convey. The coverage of, and the long feature story about the parade was on the website, you can find it, talked about the beautiful South that's gone. It was gone with the wind, that the brave young soldiers who went away. And that was the tone, that was it. So what we found in a lot of this research, in all of this research, is not only newspaper stories were what newspapers were white-owned, white reporters, white editors, a white audience, but official documentation was white-owned, white-run. Police versions of stories were presented without attribution as fact. So part of why we are trying to really take apart these stories, compare them. In the case of Willie McDaniel, there were 2 daily papers. So we lined all the stories up, and so where do they agree? Where do they disagree? What can we tell on its face is wrong, or only a police version without being attributed, which was an astonishing amount. It's not surprising that in that context, we don't have records, we don't have quotes, we don't have photographs, we don't have these men's stories. So part of what I love about Hannah's work is that she imagined them as young men, not as victims. She imagined them before, as sons, as brothers. You'll find the whole work on the website as well, because they're longer each piece, and she imagines more. What she talked about that she had not talked about before at a screening of this was that she imagined Willie McDaniel specifically, who had gone to his landlord and asked to be paid for work he had done. That is what he had done the day before he was found killed on the land that he had rented with his wife. And she imagined he and his wife sitting at their kitchen table and her saying to him, "You need to go ask him for the money. We've got bills to pay, and we need to get that money." And the horror of that, Errol, you speak of really making it personal and really real. The horror of that is very easy to understand, I think. And imagine her then, if she said something like that, or if she suggested it ever, how would you? So I think Hannah's power, particularly in this, is that she gives us these men as whole, not just as people who were killed. And there's more of that some in what we talk about in the longer narratives. We talk about the Mecklenburg Rural Police. How and why did that start? And we write a little bit about that. It was essentially as policing here was done, and you can see this in newspaper reports of laws being adopted. It was to police the enslaved and to be sure that they were where they were supposed to be. The rural police began in 1920, and it was men in Sharon Township saying, "We don't even need to get paid. We just want to go out and be able to arrest people." Just that's a remarkable statement. And they were very worried about liquor at that time, because it was, but what you see that in the stories, but then you see who they arrest.
Surprise, yeah.
What we know of each of these families, we know that Willie McDaniel was the son of a couple who had worked the land in Chester County and before that Fairfield County. We know that his grandparents also had worked the land as farm laborers. We know they first appear in the 1870 census. They're not listed as free black in earlier censuses, so we believe they were likely enslaved. We don't know that. We haven't at least yet verified that. What do we know of Melker, the landlord? We know he came from a family that had owned land in that area for at least 100 years, probably more. We know his grandfather enslaved people. We know 3 of his father and 2 uncles fought for the Confederacy. We know that land was inherited through generations and added to. We know that all of Reedy Creek Nature Preserve was owned by enslavers in 1860. So again, just through lines, but we also know, and I always just mention this and then I'll stop, that people will talk about how slavery, there just wasn't a lot of slavery in Charlotte, and that is not true. The percentages that you see of, well, hardly anybody owns slaves, often will do population, whole population, and then do a percentage. So roughly 40% of the population in Mecklenburg County in 1860 was enslaved. 40% of the population, about 6,800 people. And we know that of enslavers, if you bring it down to heads of household, free heads of household, so those were the people who could enslave others. Sometimes you had a sibling that also enslaved people that were in that. But if you take out for that, it's about 35% of people enslaved people. So I have been told for decades, oh, that just really didn't. And historians over time have said to Mecklenburg, you know, that wasn't really here. That didn't really happen much here. It happened very much here. And for the people who say, well, but just maybe enslaved 1 or 2, 40% of people enslaved 5 or more of the people enslaved. So there's just a lot of misunderstanding and bad information out there that is easy to find with a Google search. And we would ask you to be skeptical of everything that you see. Make people produce their facts. So let me stop. Did you know?
What was the average size, like the average amount of slaves that a slave owner would have in Charlotte?
There's a wild variation, so I don't think, when I say about 40% enslaved 5 or more people, I think that, so 60% enslaved fewer than 5 or fewer, 4 or fewer people.
So it was more of a plantation culture, less of like 1 or 2 slaves.
So no, that if 40% had 5 or more, you know what, I have not done the interim, but I think it was not typically just 1 or 2 people enslaved. I think you did have large plantations. Here in Mecklenburg County, you had large plantations of more than 100 people enslaved. You had many, a different project that I worked on had a man enslaved 32 people, and of those 19 were 10 or younger. And that was because cotton was pickable by children, and that's what people did. So I hope that answers. So not to go off on that, but I think it is all connected. Right?
Helen, I have a perspective. I was the interim minister at Hopewell Presbyterian Church up near Huntersville a couple of years ago. The church that they worship in today was built in 1835. It's constructed of bricks that were fired by slaves and was framed by slaves. And my understanding is that when the church was first constructed, there was obviously a downstairs where white folks worshiped. And along the back wall, there was a balcony that had a separate entrance that the slaves would use to worship up in the balcony. And so to give you a perspective, they had so many slaves eventually in that latter plantation area that Hopewell at one point took the roof off of the church that was constructed so they could add balconies on either side of the sanctuary upstairs. So now there's a balcony on 3 sides and the roof went on top of that. They had to enlarge the church to handle the number of slaves that the members of that church owned back then. So that sort of gives you a perspective in terms of maybe not exactly in urban, what we might consider urban Charlotte, but in the surrounding areas, there were a lot of slaves.
I'm gonna chime in really quickly. I think one other piece of that is when we talk about it, also understanding wealth. Because if you adjust by inflation, the cost of a singular slave at that time was worth somewhere between $30,000 and $65,000. So when we start talking about this and we talk about generational wealth and things like that, it's a part of the conversation we don't have. And I think it's also part of why we say, well, nobody really had many, because then that takes a deeper dive, right?
And it's so easy not to ever face this.
Can you flesh that out for me?
So you mean, so the cost then would have been like a couple thousand or something like that, but if you adjust it to what inflation is now, like the range of how much a singular slave was costing was between 30 and up to like 65,000 per. So when you're talking about 32 in a unit, right? So you're talking about creating millionaires and things like that, right?
So what you're describing is an aristocracy who would have reason to control black people unless they were free.
Well, we talked about Eli Whitney, right?
Yeah.
The cotton gin.
Huge.
You know, I learned about the cotton gin, but what that did was create a greater demand for more cotton and more labor, right? And
But in Charlotte, carriage makers enslaved people. Shoemakers enslaved people. This was not just cotton. Doctors enslaved people. So it wasn't just field slavery. Charlotte was enslaved people for a number of years.
one thing, and I'll shut up. Other thing about cotton though is it represented 60% of the American economy. I want to say that, the American economy. So whether you were north, south, east, west, we were benefiting, right? We're benefiting from this economy that was created by this fully profitable enterprise.
Part of what we talk with tenant farmers, again, Willie McDaniel, is right after Reconstruction, and part of Reconstruction, and EJI talks a lot about this, part of what drove lynching was this commitment to white supremacy and the desire to maintain a racial hierarchy even after emancipation. So tenant farmers had landlords who, in some documented cases and in some non-documented cases, tended to continue the relationship as if it were a relationship from slavery times. So when a black man asks to be paid a fair wage or asks to be paid for something, the Observer wrote, Mel Greer said, well, he had done some other things for him, so he didn't really think it was fair for him to ask to be paid.
Can you remind me of the dates again?
1929 was Willie McDaniel, 1913 was Joe McNeely. And the stories tell such different parts of this bigger story. There are pieces about the court system. About 3 months before Willie McDaniel was killed, was one of the first times a black man had killed a police officer and not been immediately sentenced to die, because his attorney that was hired by the NAACP said he was protecting his home. The police officer did not have a warrant, did not show any identification, and came in the middle of the night, and this man shot him. And it had not mattered mostly before why or what the circumstances were. But an attorney had found a way to get him only sentenced to second-degree murder, I think it was, and not to death. So Willie McDaniel's friends and family hired a lawyer to try to help figure out what happened. And imagine the courage it took to hire a lawyer. And that headline that said, dead Negro's friends claim was lynched, imagine when that came out. The courage that it would have taken to sustain that.
You just reminded me, I got to hear this author speak this weekend, Wright Thompson, who wrote the new book, The Barn, about Emmett Till's murder. And he said this thing that I think I will be haunted by for the rest of my life. He said, growing up, a lot of us think that there are good people and bad people. He said, in my adult years, I realized that wasn't true. And he said, but in my research of my own family history, my research of Emmett Till's ancestors and the ancestors of the murderers of Emmett Till. What I've boiled it all down to is courage and cowardice. Courage and cowardice are the things that make good and bad people. And most of us, when we really look at it, are cowards. And I can't stop thinking about that. So it's interesting when you said bravery.
Do you all have any knowledge of like the scope of, in this project, like how DJI is doing nationwide with like where other people are at, like not to diminish the work that Mecklenburg County needs to do and what we need to reckon with, but like I think about like outlying counties in North Carolina, like I just imagine that we're better equipped to have this conversation than some other counties, like what is the state, do they have any like?
Yeah, several counties have already done their
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, I was like, yeah.
So
We're
like,
not
are we
cutting edge
seeing
here.
that like urban areas are not outpacing rural areas in terms of doing this? And what do you think, what is that?
I think this is, again, I can say this having been born in Presbyterian Hospital, right? So Charlotte, through and through, right? I think even if you look at the way the story was covered, there is this image that we put out. It has always been what we do. We are great at selling the best version of ourselves, which sometimes we actually start to believe. We believe that there's a uniqueness to us, right? And so I think, so what I would say is, I think the challenge, Jane, for us is really, instead of even worrying about the other counties, is really doing a deep dive into ourselves and realizing, that's why it's called It Happened Here, right? Because I think lots of times we think of, well, this isn't the kind of thing that happens here. Even when we talk about segregation, right, with schools, we don't always talk about the bombing, with Julius Chambers of his home and things like that, right? We talk about the positives, which was how we were models for kids in Boston, which is all true. And there were other things that happened before that, right? So to Helen's point, I don't think we're ahead. I think we're playing catch up, but I think part of it is us being able to really have real raw self-assessments and recognize how is it relevant to us still today? Right.
And all the one-on-one things are the exact same, right? The arrogance of someone to think he doesn't have to pay someone, the meanness, all those are exactly the same, whether they're scaled up or down. It's the same stuff, right? So I think that's inspires me to think about it. Someone said, I can't believe there's only 2 in Mecklenburg. We know there weren't just 2. We know that. But even so, even so, it seems remarkable, and I don't feel better about that. I don't feel better.
I think it has been easier for us though, when there are only a couple of isolated incidents, to kind of gloss over it and cover it up. Because when I stood under one of those monuments and counted 40-some people that were killed at one time on one day in a place, that just, I think that would be a lot harder to cover up than say this one and this one incident. And I think that has helped us to be able to say, oh, okay, it really wasn't much of an incident for us in comparison to some of these others. And I think that I like I said, it's not any righter, but it is easier for us to kind of wash it out.
I went on the civil rights tour that's headed by the same people that do the one that Covenant has done, but it was actually for Charlotte Mecklenburg teachers. And so it was still with Larry, who a lot of y'all know, but it was this past summer, and it was all CMS teachers from across the district. And we actually got to see this video before the trip. So I've actually seen this, this is my 4th time seeing it, and it's so impactful every time. So when we went and toured the monuments, my experience with that in particular was I know the stories of the two people listed on the Mecklenburg so deeply. And so standing in front of a monument that has 40 names, that brings you to your knees when you feel so connected to just two names and then you look at the scale. And then I don't know if this was there, probably not when other people have been to the EJI, but they now have all the jars are displayed. So inside of the museum, there's like a shelf and it's got the jars from each place where they've been able to collect soil. And so they haven't collected soil everywhere yet. But you actually get to like stand there and look at like the Mecklenburg County soil jars, which was really, really cool. But I think seeing the video before going to the monuments was so impactful. I mean, the monument is phenomenal with or without the video, but having that personal connection to the two stories and then just looking at the scale and thinking each person has the depth of story, which you know, but you almost try to desensitize yourself to like protect, but when it's there, it's incredible.
Throwing out a question and also inviting folks who may be on Zoom and everything else like that as well. What's the significance of recognizing or even acknowledging and discussing things like this today? Because for a lot of, I mean, the reality is a lot of people are going to say this was so long ago. Why are we bringing it up? What is the relevance today?
Well, it's in people's DNA. I mean, the hurt, the trauma, and I mean, it's still continuing till today, and it affects all of us because it affects people in our community, some more than others. But I think just the truth sets you free or frees you up. I think, you know, looking back on West Charlotte being an example and everything, but there was, yes, so, I mean, yes, it's the glossy cover on the book, but it's not reality for so many people. And so many people have stories that, you know, and trauma to go with those stories. And until we acknowledge each other and each other's value, you know.
I think kind of like what Nikki just said, and similar is that it helps to, for us to realize just how evil people can be and how cruel we are. Which every once in a while we might need to rip that Band-Aid off ourselves to acknowledge it and say, you know, if I'd lived during that time, what side would I have been on, or why wouldn't I have spoke up? And so I think if anything, it's good for especially white male people to say, you know, that DNA, like you said, the DNA, it's in us. And how cruel can we be? And how do we not, how can we not ignore it, I guess?
Build a better future, remembering and not making the same mistakes again in the future.
And telling the true history of our country. Like,
Yeah.
Stop telling the whitewashed history that wasn't the truth. The truth deserves to be out there and people need to know, because there are still people that aren't doing better now. Like, how do we change things so that we are doing better and acknowledging the atrocities that happened here? That we have to stop dismissing, putting everything at the rug, and people need to take responsibility for standing up for people who need a voice.
I'd also say you can't really heal something without a diagnosis. So like you can't hope for better without looking at where it comes from.
Right. You gotta expose it all so that there can be true healing and hopefully some kind of better path.
First thing you do when you go to a doctor's office is you get the full medical history.
Mm-hmm.
Then they ask the family history.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They ask
The
all
ugly and the pretty and all the things.
Sure. And what most of us do is we give a sanitized version, and then it's like, well, why are you feeling this, right? Oh, no, I only drink one beer. I work in the addiction world, so I'm used to it. You know? But, you know, I always say telling your disease is telling you. Right? And so again, what does it look like to really have a full, honest assessment of the three-dimensional aspects, right? Because I think that's the thing for me when I listen is that lots of times, and that's why I was so, Jane, when you were talking about the other surrounding counties, I think lots of times with things like this, we like to think of it, I'm just gonna say it bluntly, as somebody who worked in Stanley County for 2.5 years, we like to talk about poor, rural, white people, right? And so we're like, those kind of people do this, and it's like, no, that's not it. It's this is room right here, right? And we have to lean into that in a different way if we actually want to interrupt what's going on, if that makes sense at all. You do it, and then if I get anybody who hasn't said anything yet, I'm good. Keep going.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, the whole, we were talking about Nazi Germany and acting like that's a whole different thing. A lot of these lynchings, some of them were the whole town, but some of them were just a couple people, right? A lot of the time, the whole town was watching, right? And so I think a lot of time when we talk about redlining or institutional, wealth not being passed because of sharecropping or whatever, we can talk about it like it's a separate system that's not in play anymore or something that's not touching us. But like I think these conversations are important because it is touching us, right? It's still touching us.
Yeah.
Right.
People got dressed up in their Sunday's best.
Like the woman who Emmett Till quote unquote whistled at, she's still alive, right?
She just died recently,
Oh, yes.
but yes, it's fun, yes. Go ahead, Ariel.
Oh, I just want to point out that Covenant was formed and built on the soil that this stuff happened on, right? And this church was formed and established not, that long after some of this stuff happened. So it's here, right?
The soil.
Yes, in the soil. And we can't keep acting like that's not true.
You'll also find in the long narratives, the names of the jury members who said, can't figure out who did this, nothing we can do. The names of the jury members, because that's important to have. And you'll recognize the names.
I think one thing, very haunting to think of the stadium here, but there is a documentary called Ghosts in the Stadium, and it documents 4 iconic North Carolina stadiums where racial activity happened. So I will challenge you all to look at Charlotte, but also recognize what role we play and why do we build these big, huge monuments on tragic soil.
The name of McDaniel Stadium.
It's called Ghosts in the Stadium.
Was Bull Stadium?
It was, I can't remember, I feel like Clemson was one. Tennessee, I can't remember before.
NC State, Chapel Hill, the Bank of America Stadium, and Gary, the other one. Might be Clemson.
Might be Clemson.
Well, I just think the dichotomy of now you're going and cheering for a lot of people who look like the same people who were lynched, right? And again, that we can passionately group somebody on when they have a uniform on playing for our team, but what is their humanity like when they leave the arena?
I might have told you, Justin, before when I was at Chapel Hill. At the end of the year, we were Hall of the Year, and we got a big picture made by Silent Sam statue. And there was one person in there, our resident assistant, was an African-American guy. And I admit, I didn't think anything of it then when I was younger and dumber. Didn't think about it. Took years and years for me to look back and go, damn, sorry. That was jacked up.
Now that Bill has cussed, we're gonna have to.
I say, Bill being Bill.
But I would invite y'all, any closing comments before we have to end our time at 7:31?
So will next week be a continuation of this conversation?
What do y'all think? I'll ask the group. would you continue the conversation? We have information about the other, we have more detail on each of them. I would love to get more people in the room, if you would invite other people. We can, I think do you have a thought on what do you think we ought to do?
You already asked them. Yeah, no, you're good. No, I mean, I think if you all are good with it, I think Helen has such great detail that I think obviously we can flesh out. And, you know, what we talked about when Helen and I talked about this before is we'll probably still re-show the initial ones just so if there are people who weren't here, they're caught up to speed in terms of what's being seen. But we'll also have space for folks who've already been in a conversation to advance that conversation to a deeper level if you guys are good with that. So.
Well, that's to go along with Megan. I think every time you see the video, it's still, it's so powerful. It just adds layers to your.
One thing I would encourage, and this is great, so many people turned up tonight, and this has been a great conversation, is the website is really
Here's the QR code.
Is really rich with content. If you type in, it happened here, Charlotte, you'll find it, I think.
Is it .com or .org or?
.com.
And what I would encourage, there's the stories of the two men, they're told different ways. There's a short version, there's also a version that Helen wrote about the one and I wrote about the other. They're very long, and they really give you some detail where, you know, where we challenge what happened, and you'll see things that really, you know, just rip your guts out. And I think it's really takes it to a different place to see that the only thing I would say is on this one with Willie McDaniel and with Joe McNeely, they died within hours of Willie McDaniel had mumbled under his breath during a confrontation with a person. And he said, "What did you say?" And he did not like the fact that he mumbled under his breath. Joe McNeely, as the Charlotte Observer wrote in the headline, was impudent.
Impudent.
Impudent. When you take the drama out, but was impotent and told the guard to get him water, and the observer said, of course he wouldn't do that. So it's just you learn more as you read these stories.
Complicity everywhere.
The final thought I'll just say for me is just one, obviously think to yourself about how you show up, right? So it's interesting, we always talk about when you look back at history and say, well, if I was alive then, this is what I would have done. And I always tell people, it's like, well, we can talk about what you would have done in the civil rights movement. Well, we're in our own version of it right now, right? So whatever I'm doing right now is exactly what I would have been doing back then, right? And so when we look at the way people respond to police violence and things like that, it's not random. It is because of generations of this kind of stuff that went on forever, right? And so again, imagine your trauma just being ignored over and over and over and over again. At some point, there's gonna be an expression, right? So again, I always just say, think about not only what you would have been doing back then, but you have the chance to kind of write that narrative for the next generation that's gonna look back at us at some point.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Justin.
QR code there.